Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Crocker, and I'm so thrilled that you're here today to talk to us about so many topics and especially your research. Here today with Professor and Ohio eminent scholar in social psychology from Ohio State University, Dr. Jennifer Crocker. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here, and I was introduced to your research and your work by Dr. Patrick Carroll, who has also done an interview with us in our virtual symposium. And so he really talked about this idea of contingent self-worth. But one of the things you talk about in your research is self-esteem. And I wanted to start our talk off today, our interview, with a discussion about self-esteem. And, I have here that self-esteem really is about the desire to believe that one is worthy or valuable, and it drives behavior and shapes how people think about themselves, other people, and events in their lives. And some people think that this is a universal human need, that we need to have high self-esteem. And for years, schools have been driving this whole idea of improving children's self-esteem. But you've discovered in your research that when people have too much of a focus on either boosting self-esteem or avoiding a loss in self-esteem, that this can be very problematic for us. And so I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. In my work, I found it really helpful to distinguish between having self-esteem and pursuing self-esteem. So people who have self-esteem, their self-esteem is relatively high, but it's not a particular concern of theirs to make sure that they protect their self-esteem or enhance their feelings of self-worth. On the other hand, some people really do focus on pursuing self-esteem, of trying to demonstrate or prove their worth and value to themselves and to other people. And it's that pursuit that I think is really problematic. So for the most part, having self-esteem is not a bad thing. There are some people who argue that people who are high in self-esteem have kind of diluted positive views of themselves. They overestimate how favorably they're seen by other people and so on. But I'm not saying that it's bad to have high self-esteem. There is some evidence that low self-esteem can create problems for people. The one thing we know absolutely for sure is that people who are low in self-esteem are unhappy. They're less satisfied with their lives. They have a lot more negative mood. They're vulnerable to depression and anxiety. So clearly there's an emotional state that goes with having low self-esteem, which I think is part of what drives people to pursue self-esteem. Apart from just being happier, there aren't too many objective, documented benefits of being high in self-esteem. So if it was a fundamental human need, we would expect that people who are high in self-esteem would be objectively doing better in all kinds of domains of their lives. And there's very little evidence that suggests that self-esteem actually causes people to have better outcomes, more success, more academic achievement, to be more popular, and so on. The one exception to that, I think recently there's mounting evidence that high self-esteem people have better relationships, or that low self-esteem people do things that can undermine their relationships. But apart from that, there's not much evidence that there's a lot of benefits that go with having high self-esteem, except that you're happier, which makes sense. If I feel that I'm worthless, I'm likely to feel pretty bad.
Yeah.
So that all refers to just having self-esteem or not having self-esteem. And in my work, I've argued that the problem isn't so much whether we have it or not, but what we do to try to get those feelings of self-worth. And since having low self-esteem does feel bad, we know that people have a lot more negative mood when their self-esteem is low. And when people have a temporary drop in self-esteem, that feels very bad. It's very painful and unpleasant to have a loss of feelings of self-worth. And as a result, I argue that people can be motivated to maintain their self-esteem or to boost their self-esteem. And that's where the problems really come in. So everybody wants to feel good. And so they try to boost their self-esteem to get that good feeling, that high that goes with, I'm great. It's not only that I did great, but I am great. And they really want to avoid those feelings of I'm worthless as a human being. So people can be driven to get self-esteem, to get those highs of self-esteem and to avoid the lows that come with loss of self-esteem. And that's where a lot of the problems come in.
One of the things that Patrick Carroll spoke about was, things like self-sabotage, for example. So these are these are behaviors and consequences of self-doubt. And I can see how the pursuit of self-esteem can lead to damaging behaviors or behaviors that stop us from moving forward with our pursuits. Something like self-sabotage, have you found that in your research, or procrastination, for example?
We have found all of those things. So, for example, we've done a lot of studies of college students and their pursuit of self-esteem. And we find that when students are pursuing self-esteem, they tend to lose interest in their classes. They get exhausted. They feel like they don't have enough. They're spending a lot of time, for example, on their academics, or if their self-esteem is based on being attractive, they're spending money on clothes and getting into debt. So there are these costs that go along with the pursuit of self-esteem. And one thing I've argued is that when self-esteem is your goal, when feeling worthy and valuable is your goal, on the one hand, that can be very motivating, right? Because you want to succeed in order not to feel like you're a worthless human being. Mm-hmm. And in order to get that boost, that high of I'm really great. The problem is that when self-esteem is really the goal and you don't know that you can succeed, or if you actually fail, then what you'll do is try to maintain and protect your self-esteem rather than figure out what do I actually need to do to succeed, right? So it's that's when people will self-handicap. We find that students will listen to music that they know will impede their performance in order to give themselves an excuse for failure, or they'll choose not to practice when they're going to take a test that's very difficult and they're not sure they can succeed on it. So they're busy setting up reasons why they didn't succeed that will protect their self-esteem. So that feels safer to them to have their excuse lined up. The problem is those things actually undermine their chances of success. So that's the self-handicapping problem.
Yeah, and I find self-handicapping a very interesting behavior and consequence, because while we're trying to protect ourselves, we're also ruining our future opportunities, which could contribute to us even feeling better or feeling good about our accomplishments.
This happens in academics. We also have some very recent data that aren't published yet, but we've been doing a study of romantic couples in our lab. And we're finding that students who are self-protective in their romantic relationship, they want to make sure they don't get hurt.
Yes.
Their relationship goes downhill fast.
Really?
And their relationship partner becomes more self-protective. So their satisfaction, they fall out of love.
Oh, wow.
As a function of having this, I have to watch out to make sure I don't get hurt.
Right.
They don't go into their relationships with a kind of wholeheartedness. And I think the same thing is true with work and with school, that to really give yourself the best chance of accomplishing your goals, you need to be wholehearted. Not hold back a piece of yourself or a piece of your effort, or make sure the excuses are all in place in order to really give yourself 100% of the possibility that you have to succeed. Yes. And when people are self-protective, they hold back enough that they undermine their relationships and they undermine their achievement.
Well, and I would imagine failure becomes much more difficult to handle if if you are constantly pursuing self-esteem.
Right, because failure doesn't just mean I failed at that task. it means I'm a failure as a human being. I'm a worthless human being. And that's really very, very painful for people. And that we know for sure, that it really hurts to draw that conclusion that I'm worthless.
Of course, yeah.
So people do these things to protect themselves from that implication, including things like blaming other people, blaming the circumstances. We've already talked about self-handicapping, but a lot of what people do when they do fail is they just target somebody else, you know. So you get this kind of rage against other people or the situation or the system or whatever else. And that rage is very destructive, both personally and also to relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what you talk a lot in your research as well about contingent self-worth. So what is that, and why is that problematic?
Well, so people tend to base their self-esteem not on succeeding at everything, but on they tend to invest their sense of self-worth in their certain kinds of domains of life. So some people want to be outstanding at sports, and other people want to be outstanding at school, and some people want to be the best mother in the world. And, you know, so people invest their sense of self-worth in particular things. So William James is a psychologist who really described this phenomenon over 100 years ago, where he said his self-esteem was not staked on being a linguist, but on being a psychologist, right? So he would feel worthy when he was succeeded at psychology, but he didn't much care if he couldn't speak Greek or Latin, right? So,
Right.
so we all tend to invest our self-esteem in some things, and those are the things where we really want to succeed because that will make us feel worthy, and we really don't want to fail. Other things we don't care that much about. For me personally, I don't care if I win or lose at tennis, for example.
Me too. I was just going to say, tennis, don't care.
Right, right. So my self-worth is not contingent on how I do in tennis at all. So that's the idea of contingent self-esteem, is that there are certain domains in which we've really invested our self-worth, and succeeding in those domains really proves that we're great, and failing will then mean that we're worthless. So we studied this. I did a study several years ago. One of my favorite studies, it's a small study, but was really a window into the lives of real people. We had University of Michigan seniors who were applying to graduate school, most of them to PhD programs, a few of them to master's programs. And we measured how much they invested their self-worth in their academic success. And then for the next couple of months, so we did this in January, right before they were starting to hear whether they were admitted to or rejected from graduate school. And so for the next few months, we had them just go to a website and fill out a survey every few days to tell us what's happening. Did you get accepted? Did you get rejected? And they filled out a self-esteem scale on those days. And we could see the effects of acceptances and rejections on their self-esteem as a function of how much their self-esteem was staked on academics. So what you see is that the less contingent students, their self-esteem moved very little over that 2 months. So they stayed pretty high and very steady. Whereas the students whose self-worth was really invested in self-esteem, and this is a group of very accomplished students who were pretty contingent on self-esteem as a group, but the ones who were most contingent in that group, you could just see that on days they received an acceptance, they got a significant boost to their self-esteem. Not huge, but it was there. But then on days they received a rejection, their self-esteem would plummet, just go way down.
Wow.
And it actually stayed low until they got an acceptance from a graduate school. So their self-esteem, their feelings that they were a worthwhile human being, were completely at the mercy of the most recent news they had gotten from a graduate program. Not even kind of the overall, am I getting in or not getting in, or did somebody want me? But really just the most recent graduate program, that would push their sense of self-worth either up or down, and it wouldn't move again until that somebody else gave them some more news. So that's a very
Wow.
tough situation to be in. And it's really remarkable how big those effects were, especially for the most contingent students.
Yeah.
A couple of other things we also looked at in that study that I thought were really interesting. One is that these increases and decreases in self-esteem across time predict over those 2 months an increase in symptoms of depression. So there's something about having your self-esteem jerked around by events in your life that makes people more depressed over time. And we're not the only people who have found that. There are other researchers have found that as well.
Wow.
And the other thing that was interesting is kind of on a whim. When students started the study, we asked them we gave them a piece of paper. They just said, just tell us what it would mean for you or about you to get into graduate school. We just wanted to know, how did they think about getting into graduate school? And when we looked at the data at the end of the study, the students whose self-esteem was most contingent, well, let me start with the students whose self-esteem was less contingent. What they said things like, well, it wouldn't really mean anything about me as a person per se. It would mean I've been given the opportunity to learn and grow in my field, right? So very much a kind of learning orientation. It's not a reflection on my worth and value, but it's really a great opportunity for me. The students whose self-esteem was most contingent said things like, it would prove once and for all that I am intelligent and valuable, and other people will see that I have worth and valuable and that I'm really smart. So that they really took it as a statement about them, a judgment of them that indicated that they had worth and value. And I think that's a really tough place to be, because when the statement is positive, that's great. But if the statement is negative, you really feel terrible about that.
Yeah.
So it makes you very vulnerable.
Yeah, and it really affects your efficacy beliefs.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So students with contingent self-esteem really are trying to prove that they have worth and value. Whereas the students with less contingent self-esteem, we did a study and showed that they're much more learning and mastery oriented. They really have the goal to get better at their field, to master their field. Um,
Yeah.
that orientation is very helpful, especially if you're doing something like going to graduate school.
Yes, and I would imagine that that's along the lines of Carol Dweck's work on a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And we also have an interview with Dr. Dweck as well, who will explain more about that. But let me ask you this. So in the self-efficacy research, we know that one of the best ways to build self-efficacy, or if I can use a more general term, self-confidence, and we know that efficacy is our belief in our ability to be successful in any given task or any given situation or context. So we know that actually going out and performing and feeling that we were successful at something is the best way to improve our self-efficacy and our beliefs about ourselves. So it would be logical then to say, okay, I was successful at this, and so therefore, I believe in myself more. And and yet, our society in general is just so focused on accomplishment and achievement. It just seems like, you know, we don't feel good about ourselves if we're not achieving and accomplishing. So how do you go about kind of separating your self-worth from your feelings of accomplishment? It seems hard in our society.
It does. I think it's helpful to remember that if we believe we're worthy and valuable when we succeed, that also means we're worthless when we fail, right? And I don't think most of us would make those kinds of judgments about other people, and yet we feel quite free to make them about ourselves. But I think one of the things that's very helpful to think about it, ask ourselves is, why is this important? So it's true that having a mastery orientation is usually very helpful for people. It can motivate very productive behaviors. It's not helpful under all circumstances. So the question is, why do I want to master this? And sometimes in our data, pretty often, underneath a mastery orientation is, well, if I can master this, it will prove that I'm worthy and valuable. And that can be just as problematic, right? So then you believe that you should be able to learn and improve and succeed at something. You should be able to master things. And when things get very difficult, it's challenging. And those are the circumstances in which we find people self-handicap, right? So mastery-oriented people, in general, they do better when they fail than low mastery-oriented people. But there's certain circumstances where mastery is very difficult, where the problem is really hard and you don't know if you'll be able to master it. If you're trying to prove something about yourself, then again, it creates that same vulnerability. So what I think it's useful is to ask, well, why does it matter to me to master this? Am I just trying to prove something about myself? In which case, I'm going to have the same vulnerabilities, the same possibility of handicapping myself. Or is there something more than that that's at stake here for me? Is there something I care about that's just beyond my own ego or self-image or self-esteem? Is there something I want to contribute? Is there some difference I want to make to other people? And that can provide a reason to, in fact, in our data that is very consistent, that people with that motivation, who are driven by what they want to contribute beyond themselves, are more mastery-oriented, and their self-esteem is not vulnerable. But they're not. It's not about me, right? It's about something outside of me that I'm doing this for.
And I like that because, I really like this question of why. Why do I need to master this? And I think, if people, and women especially, can be focused in on, am I doing this because I need to prove to myself and others, and then I will feel good about myself, and to be able to ask that question. And so I guess is the strategy to say, I'm good enough. I'm good enough, and to start at a baseline of I feel worthy and I feel good enough. How do you get that baseline if you're not feeling worthy, if you're not feeling any kind of self-worth?
Well, this is a little bit more of a philosophical point of view than based in data. But as I've worked on this issue of self-esteem, excuse me, for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, it strikes me that actually just asking the question, do I have worth and value, it's just not a helpful thing to do. It's not a question that will get you anywhere you want to go. So if your conclusion is yes, so what? And if your conclusion is no, then you can become totally preoccupied again with, what do I have to do to have worth and value? Who do I have to prove it to? What success will finally prove that I have worth and value as a human being? So in my view, just asking the question about, do I have worth and value as a human being, is just not a helpful question to ask. I think we could all just take it for granted that because we're human beings, we have worth and value, right? Just don't think about it. It's not a useful thing to think about.
Right. And we are human living being on this earth, and that's enough.
Right. And that's all that you have to. It doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we haven't made mistakes or done terrible things from time to time. But then the question is, what do I want to do to make things better for me and for other people? And I think getting the focus off of my own self-esteem and these questions about my worth and value, that's what takes us down that rabbit hole of self-doubt, self-preoccupation, second-guessing ourselves, holding back from really, working toward our goals wholeheartedly. And instead, if we can find something that we care about beyond ourselves, might start with your family or your kids, because most people care very deeply about their kids, more than they do about their own self-esteem. But it can be it can be an institution, it can be a value, it could be anything from world peace to making a contribution to science to helping other people deal with their issues of self-doubt, right? So there's many ways you can shift the focus, shift the question away from what does this mean about me to what am I trying to accomplish here? What am I trying to give or contribute? And once that focus is off the self, we know that people relax. They feel more clear. They feel more connected to other people. They're more at ease. They're happier, and they function much more effectively. So getting that focus away from the self, and really, I think people have to figure out for themselves what it is that they really care about. I can't tell somebody, you should care about this or you should care about that, right? But if you care about the planet and the state we're going to leave it in the future, or if you care about war, or you care about poverty, or you know, whatever it is that really touches you that's outside of your own ego, that's going to really help you be more effective.
Yes.
And in our data, those kinds of goals are the ones that actually lead to long-term increases in people's self-esteem.
Yes, and you talked about this in the latest papers that you sent me, which I found very, very fascinating. And when I read it, I've had an interview with Sonia Lubomirsky, and we were talking about rumination, and she specifically referenced this idea of being self-absorbed, and how being self-absorbed and focus on yourself actually leads to greater rumination when you have that constant focus. And what I really liked about your paper was about this self-preservation. There's two different kinds of motivation systems that people have. This self-preservation, as you were talking about, more sort of egocentric kind of motivation, or you call it the ecosystem. And then there's also the ecosystem, which is a motivation that is oriented more outwardly. So towards, how am I thinking about other people and other things in my life, and how I can contribute to other things in my life. And that made a lot of sense to me, that when we stop thinking about ourselves, or taking pity on ourselves, or feeling sorry for ourselves, or thinking, how did we look in that situation? I know for me, for example, when I do big talks, what really calms me down is I used to think about, oh my God, how's my hair? How are these pants? Do these, pants make me look fat? Or,
Right.
I stopped thinking about that and instead thought, I'm here to deliver a message to help as many people as possible. So my intention today is just to come and share what I know and to help. And once I took the focus off me, I found such a sense of relief. And I think that's what you're talking about here in your latest research.
Exactly. And I think your example is a really great one, that I've had that experience myself in giving talks and teaching and all kinds of experiences. And one thing that's important, I think, for people to keep in mind is that this sort of distinction between the ecosystem, where it's all about what things mean about me, versus the ecosystem in which I'm caring about something larger than myself. It's not that I'm selfless, right? It's not that I sacrifice myself, but I'm thinking about others' needs as well as my own needs. What's good for other people and good for me. And that's really important, because there's a version of caring about others that looks very selfless, but is actually that I'm trying to prove what a good person I am, or how indispensable I am to other people. So that it's a little bit tricky. I think people can get confused. I can get confused that between am I doing for others to prove how wonderful I am and get them to recognize how great I am. A psychologist named Vicki Helgeson has called that unmitigated communion. It's this idea that there are people who are, trying to be very selfless, but in fact, her research shows that they're doing it because of their own self-esteem issues. They need other people to love and appreciate them.
Yes.
So I think it's really important to keep in mind that in the ecosystem, it's not that my needs don't matter. It's that my needs are no more and no less important than other people's needs. And that if I am in a system, some social system, a family, a work group, a group of friends where everybody's needs are being met, it's going to be better for me and for them and for the system, right? So the business is going to function better if people's needs are getting met. It's going to function better than if I'm worried more about my needs and other people can just take care of themselves, or I get what I want at the expense of other people, right? So it's that delicate place where things are good for me and good for others that really seems to be connected to the ecosystem motivation.
And it seems like, so it's the difference, I think, is this preoccupation with whether I look good or not.
Mhm.
So I have certain needs, but not the need to have to, look good.
Right, right.
Okay.
So I don't think the need to look good is actually a fundamental human need.
Yeah.
It's a desire,
Yeah,
right?
a desire. Right, right.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yes.
yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So if we can worry less about what other people think of us, or what other people are saying, etc., that is what might be one step towards this more ecosystem kind of motivating factors.
Although again, I think you have to be a little bit careful. The question is, why do I care,
Mhm.
right? So if I have to have other people's approval to feel good about myself, because my self-worth is contingent on what other people think about me, that's going to really put me at the mercy of what other people think, right? I'm going to have to please them. I'm not going to feel like I can say no. It's going to make me feel very pressured anytime someone makes a request of me or my performance is being evaluated. On the other hand, I can care about what other people think in the space of ecosystem motivation, right? And in that space, it's just information. So if I give a talk and people say that was the worst talk I've ever heard, it was completely confusing, instead of saying, oh, that's a judgment of me, I can say, okay, what went wrong? What didn't work? How can I communicate more effectively? So so you can care about what other people think. In fact, I think for almost everybody, it does matter what other people think. But it doesn't matter because that determines my self-esteem.
Yeah.
It matters because if I want to make a difference for others, it's useful to know how they're responding to what I'm doing. Is that
So, yes, that is so useful. That is such useful information and such a great strategy, because I can imagine if you're taking this kind of critical feedback and it's killing you and it's really hurting your self-esteem, you're not going to want to hear more. You're not going to want to have to deal with that information. You're not going to want to do anything with that information. You're going to say, "Oh, that horrible person who said all that horrible stuff about me, just get away
if
from
they don't
me."
appreciate me, they don't get what I'm trying to say, which is so brilliant, and I just don't
Yeah.
understand it, or
Right.
they're don't deserve to have me, the gift of my
Yeah.
wisdom or whatever it is. So we tend to really, again, go after the other person or other people, and that destroys our connection. We don't
Yeah.
feel connected with them. Whereas if we can say, oh, that's interesting. Why did you have that reaction? Where did you have a problem with what I did? What specifically didn't work for you? I'd love to know that because that would really help me be more effective in the future. Then that actually builds connections. Other people feel, first of all, they feel respected because they feel like you're really listening to their opinion, even if they expressed it in a perhaps a harsh way. They feel like they're being attended to, and that you're listening to them and respecting them, and then you can start connecting around. Oh, this is what I like. This is what I didn't like, and really start to form a relationship, even
Well,
with our worst critics.
and so important if we want to get good at what we do.
Right, right.
So critical. Now, so I'm wondering, when we talk about women, and women really, we talked about how self-esteem, we feel good in certain domains, in other domains, we care more. Do you find that women in general need to feel perfect or excellent at so many domains these days, that can affect our self-esteem? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't really study perfectionism, but uh, in my work, what I find is that women tend to, and these are mostly college students, but I think this is true of women in general. Women tend to invest their sense of self-worth in other people's approval, in their appearance, in their academic success, and in getting the love and support of their family. And those are all things that put your sense of self-worth at the mercy of other people, right? So they're very external sources of self-worth. And those things will um, make you anxious over time. They'll make you depressed. We have data that they predict increases in symptoms of depression. So what women tend to do, we know that women are more relational in a lot of ways. They just in general care more about relationships, which is not a bad thing. But in this version of being relational where my self-worth depends on what other people are thinking about me and how I look and other people's approval and do other people think I'm doing a good job and so on. That's really the risky way for women to be.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to a male colleague not long ago, and we were talking about housework. And I said, well, a lot of women I know get stressed out about the housework. And he said, well, I get stressed out too when the house, is messy. And I said, yes, but do you call yourself a bad father because your house is messy? And
Right.
he said, no, of course not.
Right. I
Whereas
told my
right?
husband, when people come over to dinner and the house is a mess, who gets judged? It's
Yeah,
not him, it's me, right?
exactly.
So, yeah, so I think women feel like they're much more likely to be judged on all kinds of different things like that.
Yes.
How the kids are being raised and
Yes,
the house
exactly.
is clean and pretty and all that. Sorry, I interrupted
Yeah.
you.
No, no, but it does go back to once again, this kind of focus on ourselves.
Right.
And, if we can take that focus away from ourselves, while still taking care of ourselves and our needs, I think is one step towards a healthier way of being, a way where we can build our improve our own feelings of self-worth, or protecting our feelings of self-worth,
Right.
but also improving our self-confidence.
Right. Right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this discussion has just been very fascinating and very enlightening. And I hope that you continue to send me your latest research, because I'd really like to, continue to delve more into this. Especially the idea of the ego system and the ecosystem. I think it's so important for women. I think women are doing wonderful things in the world, including yourself. And so I think this is only going to help women do better and go out and really create, the wonderful things that they need to be creating in this world to make this world a better place. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, have a good day.
Thank you.